November 2, which marks the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, is a very important day for press freedom. More specifically, to focus on the crucial question of safety of journalists, who need an enabling environment and not a climate of fear in order to do their jobs to the best of their ability. And that's not the case in many parts of the world, where many have been killed and disappeared, have been tortured or physically attacked. Often these cases are not investigated and the killers go unpunished. Mozambique is one of the countries in which attacks on journalists has become commonplace. So I'm very happy today to talk via Zoom to Fernando Goncalves, editor of Mozambique's leading weekly newspaper, Savannah, and chairperson of that country's chapter of the Media Institute of Southern Africa, on the issue of safety, and more specifically, the 2017 disappearance of journalist and human rights advocate Ibrahim Baruch, who hasn't been seen since reporting on the insurgency in the Cabo Delgado area. You're listening to Free Speak, a podcast of the Namibia Media Trust, which is available on SoundCloud and iTunes, and I'm your host, Gwen. So welcome, Fernando, and thank you so much for taking time from your very busy newsroom to talk to me today.
Thank you, Gwen, for having me on your show.
Thank you, Fernando. So we'll start right off by asking you how to end impunity for crimes against journalists. This is the focus of our discussion today. And Ibrahim is one of those journalists whose disappearance has received international attention. But more than that, I think credit must be given to MISA Mozambique, which has been in the forefront of reporting the situation in Cabo Delgado right from the outset. So Fernando, could you briefly tell us what you know right now about the circumstances surrounding his disappearance?
Well, thank you, Gwen. Just to give you a background, Ibrahim Baruch was working for a local radio station, which is supposed to be a community radio station, but which in fact is run by government. That's a different arrangement we have here.
Right.
So it's very difficult to say what is a community radio station, because government has also radio stations which it calls community radio stations.
Right.
So 7th April in Mozambique is it's Women's Day, and therefore it's a public holiday. Baruch had just left the station on his way home on that day in 2020, when he sent a message to one of his colleagues saying that he had been surrounded by soldiers.
Right.
That was the last time that was heard of him, and all subsequent efforts to locate him have so far failed, and all inquiries made with the authorities have not yielded any positive result. Prior to his disappearance, there had been cases of arbitrary arrests of journalists in Cabo Delgado.
Right.
But due to the intervention from MISA, those journalists were not sentenced. So maybe for those who did it, they thought that maybe making the journalists disappear was easier than going through the whole complicated process of going through the courts.
It's really shocking.
This is all we know about the situation or the circumstance under which Ibrahim Baruch disappeared on the 7th of April of 2020.
Honestly, it's obviously been a couple of years since he disappeared. Are there ongoing efforts, Fernando, by family and media efforts to find out the truth of what's happened to Ibrahim? And do you think there's enough international pressure still being applied on the Mozambican authorities to solve this case? I mean, really, to get to the bottom line, do you think he's dead?
Well, MISA Mozambique has been working with the family in order to find out what happened, and indeed whether he's still alive. We at MISA even wrote a letter to the President of the Republic seeking his good offices in finding out what could have happened. But it has been a very big disappointment. I'm not sure what other initiatives could have been taken outside Mozambique, but I don't think we have exhausted all possible avenues. I think the authorities have to be held to account. It cannot be part of a new normal that individuals just disappear and everyone just keeps quiet. So something has to be done. We have done everything we could do. We have made inquiries with the authorities, but we have not got any information that could lead to locating Ibrahim Baruch. I'm afraid to say this. I don't think Ibrahim Baruch at this stage could still be alive because I think because of the pressure that has been brought to bear on the authorities, it's quite possible that they might have decided that getting rid of him was the best way that they can deal with the issue.
And I'm sure, Fernando, everybody, I think, not only in Mozambique, but further afield, really want answers to this critical question of what happened to him. But as you know, UNESCO says that in 9 out of 10 cases of the 1,200 journalists who've been killed since or between 2006 and 2020, the killings have not been resolved, and the killers mostly go unpunished in cases of kidnap, torture, and physical attacks. To what extent, I mean, apart from the case of Ibrahimo, is shooting the messenger, so to speak, a problem in Mozambique in general?
Impunity is a very serious problem in Mozambique.
Right.
Organized crime permeates almost every level of the state machinery, including the police, the criminal investigation services, the intelligence services, etc. Corruption is rife. So in an environment like that, it's very hard to get perpetrators of crimes against journalists to be held to account, because in most cases, these crimes against journalists are committed by individuals who are related to the security services.
Absolutely.
And quite often they do so in the name of the security of the state, so they cannot prosecute themselves. In the case of Baruch, for example, there is a very strong suspicion that there could have been an involvement of state security agents. And that is because of the very strange way the authorities have responded to every inquiry that we have made whenever we approach them. So it is very serious when security services acting on behalf of state security, they commit these crimes and they find a way of hiding them so that they will never be caught. So I think this is a very serious problem, and this is it's a problem that we have to address, as you said, not just here in Mozambique, but throughout the world, because this is not happening only in Mozambique.
And I'm just wondering, Fernando, I agree with you obviously 100%, but I'm just wondering whether this day to end impunity for crimes against journalists is really going to make a difference to change the minds of intransigent governments like Mozambique, to change this climate of impunity. And I'm also wondering whether, does it really make a difference, do you think, to those journalists who are working under threat?
I think it's a very important day. This is 2nd of November.
Right.
But I don't think the government in Mozambique even takes notice.
Okay.
Quite often, government officials at a very high level feel that the media is there to get them. So their predisposition is that if anything untoward happens to a journalist, that is because that journalist deserves it. I mean, they don't say it loudly, they don't say it in public.
But it's implied, yes.
You can see that it's implied in their attitude, in the way they act. And they don't say it openly, but you can feel, you can almost sense that it is implied in the very indifferent way they respond to such cases. I don't think governments will willingly commit themselves to issues that have to do with the safety of journalists. But I think it is incumbent upon media rights organizations and activists like ourselves to keep driving the message and also working with like-minded international organizations like UNESCO and Free Press and Reporters Without Borders and so forth, try to develop an international framework on crimes against journalists that is binding to all member states of the international community.
Absolutely. And Fernando, just thinking aloud, I'm just wondering how we in Africa can find ways and means to put more pressure on, Organization of African Unity and SADC to really get them to commit. But, I know that's going to be a difficult job as well. But you mentioned it just briefly now. There's a new initiative in an attempt to achieve some kind of justice in the cases of the murder of journalists. Free Press Unlimited, which you mentioned, along with Reporters Sans Frontières and the Committee to Protect Journalists, have launched a People's Tribunal to investigate cases and hold governments to account, which will sit for the first time at The Hague on November 2. And in this case, the governments of Sri Lanka, Mexico, which of course is the world's most dangerous country for journalists right now, and Syria will be indicted. The prosecutor has said, and I quote, "It is time that states are held accountable," unquote. Your thoughts on whether this bold move by media freedom organizations can also help draw international attention to impunity and make a difference?
I think these are the international frameworks that I have been referring to.
Right.
We already have the International Criminal Court in The Hague that has been used to indict and prosecute human rights violators, those who commit crimes against humanity. I think it is such mechanisms that we need in relation to crimes committed against journalists. Not just to prosecute, but most importantly, to intervene to investigate thoroughly cases of disappearance and killing of journalists. I know SADC has a protocol that covers issues of freedom of the press.
Right.
There is at the level of the African Union, there is the African Charter on Peoples and Human Rights. There is the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression in Africa. But I think all these frameworks, they are there, but I think it is very important that the message is sent out to the governments and to ensure that they develop internal mechanisms in their own countries to make sure that these frameworks, these international frameworks that already exist, are taken into account and they are adhered to very strictly.
Absolutely, and not just paying lip service to these instruments, but not really implementing them in principle and in practice. Fernando, one of the things that always astounds me when it comes to issues around press freedom, and obviously we know the family of Ibrahim want answers to the disappearance, and so do all families of journalists who've disappeared want answers to what's happened to them. But the one thing that always astounds me is there is such a lack of, or it seems like there is a lack of sustained public outrage when journalists are killed or disappeared in many countries. And, I think here in Namibia, where recently 2 or 3 people were shot by the Botswana Defense Forces in our northern region here for fishing illegally, and there was huge outcry among the citizens in Namibia. But when a journalist or something goes missing, this is not the case. Is there any kind of outrage in Mozambique on the disappearance of Ibrahim, for example?
You are right about what you are saying. You see, if you want people not to bother the state, first you impoverish them, make them as poor as possible. Then you ensure that they they have no time to pursue issues of public interest.
Right.
Because they are so busy just to ensure their basic survival.
Right.
The second thing you do is you intimidate them. You make them believe that issues of the state are not of their concern, and that whenever they raise matters that have to do with governance issues, they're indulging in acts of subversion. So this is how states quite often operate when it comes to dealing with the rights of citizens. You also make them understand that those who have got problems with the state are of their own making, and that whoever comes up in their support will face the same fate. So people are so poor and thoroughly intimidated that they do not dare to raise their voice. That is what is happening in Mozambique. So you find very few people and very few organizations who understand that fighting for such causes is to their own benefit. Often I tell people that issues of media, you should never made to think that they pertain only to journalists.
Right.
They pertain to the entire society, because journalists are not working for themselves. They work for the good of the society. So if they are silenced, then it is society that is being silenced in itself.
Right. And in a sense, I suppose governments are being clever in a certain way, in that, as Afrobarometer has showed us, there are declining levels of trust in the media across Africa. And governments tend to probably capitalize on this, and, they make journalists the enemies too. And so, as you say, the citizens are afraid to speak out when they die and go missing, not realizing that the rights of journalists are the same rights as their own rights.
Yes, as I have said before, it is very rare indeed that a crime will be committed and the culprits will be held to account. And this is part of this environment of massive intimidation. This idea that state affairs are sacred and they can only be dealt with by the state itself, and that citizens have nothing to do with issues of governance.
Right.
And I think it is this sense of fear that is instilled in the people that we really have to fight against and really make sure that we overcome that.
Exactly. And maybe just to add on to that, Fernando, is apart from the devastating personal impact on journalists at risk as well as their families, impunity, as you've said, also fuels a climate of fear. In a time of severe threat also for the future of good journalism, less and less young people will be inclined to choose a career that puts their lives at risk. Is this chill effect manifested also in Mozambique, do you find, at the moment, that young people are less likely to take on the work of public service in the media because of this fear?
Well, to a certain extent, it is true that young people will be deterred from practicing journalism because of their risks associated with the profession. At times, it will be their own parents or relatives who will discourage them from pursuing journalism as a career.
Absolutely.
But there is a lot of brave young people who are determined to ensure that their society is rooted in the ideals of democracy, and who are prepared to fight for their rights. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Oh, excellent.
There is a lot of young people who, whether either as journalists or as activists in civil society, are determined to fight for a democratic society, for a rules-based society, and I think it's quite encouraging. But of course, the pressures are there. Relatives will tell their kids that, look, we have looked after you all this time. We have invested in you. We don't really think going into journalism is a good idea because you'd rather go into medicine or engineering or any other being a lawyer or any other profession that brings you good money. But I think there is an understanding amongst the young people that there is the need to fight for freedom, and that freedom does not come on a silver platter.
That's very encouraging to hear, Fernando. And I think, in Namibia too, what you say about families and peer pressure also has a lot of influence on young people taking on careers in journalism, which, as we both know, is a question of public service rather than getting material gains from what we do. But I'm glad to hear there are young people, willing to put their money where their mouths are and, as you say, fight for freedom. And journalism is one way, certainly, to do that. Just briefly, a reference, something that you've actually alluded to already. Carlos Cardozo's murder in 2000 was one of Mozambique's most notorious killings of journalists. In this and other cases of deaths and disappearances, there's often a connection, which you've alluded to the military or to the corridors of power in one way or another. Do you think this is a fairly fair assessment of impunity in Mozambique, or are there other agendas at play in this dangerous world for journalists?
As I said, when those crimes are committed by the very same people who are paid to prevent and investigate them.
Exactly.
And more so when such is done in the name of the interest of the state, then you can rest assured that they will not be investigated, and therefore the culprits will never be found. In the case of Carlos Cardozo, it wasn't because the state was determined to investigate the case and bring the culprits to trial. The main reason was Cardozo was married to a national of a very powerful donor.
Right.
In addition to the fact that he himself was very well connected within the donor community.
Absolutely.
So the donors threatened to cut off aid, which Mozambique could not live without.
Right.
Mozambique could not afford not to have that aid. And so when the donors threatened to cut off aid, then Mozambique had to act. But even then, doubts still persist as to whether all those involved in the murder of Carlos Cardozo have all been prosecuted.
Right.
There are still doubts that not everyone who was involved in the murder of Carlos Cardozo was prosecuted. But nevertheless, those who carried out that heinous crime were prosecuted. But we don't know about those who ordered that killing, whether they have also been prosecuted.
Exactly.
There is a widely held view and perception that those people have managed to get scot-free.
Absolutely. And this is what, obviously, impunity to those of us in the profession, whether we work in democratic countries, in my own case to a large extent, or yours, where there are a lot more threats to journalists, is a concern of all of us. An injury to one is an injury to all. And so anything it takes must be done to really bring an end to impunity. And maybe, Fernando, on that note, I'm going to ask you just for because I could talk to you for hours about this, as you know, and we've talked for hours in the past about just such concerns. But give me your final thoughts on what you think it will take in Africa in general and Mozambique more specifically to bring an end to crimes of impunity against journalists and instead to ensure a safe working environment in which they can exercise their craft, which we all agree is so essential for the maintenance of democracy and economic development, to borrow the words of the 1991 Windhoek Declaration.
There is a trial that is going on in Mozambique right now. It has to do with the so-called hidden debts.
Yes.
Which is the largest financial scandal in Mozambique, involving $2.2 billion. there are 19 people who are on trial in connection with that case. Some of those who are on trial are senior officers of the intelligence services,
Right.
including the former Director General. So people can see that those in the security service can be held to account. So they become less fearful of them. There have also been a few cases of prosecution against individuals who have committed violence against journalists. I'm talking here of police officers, but they are of a very lower rank. So I think the starting point is that journalists themselves have to understand what mechanisms are there available for them to use when their rights are violated. But in addition to that, I think there has to be a degree of engagement with the security forces, for example, so that they become aware of certain acts that violate the professional rights of journalists. Because sometimes, especially when this involves police officers or officers of other arms of the state security apparatus of a lower ranking, sometimes they do this out of ignorance. And I think it is very important that we engage with them and, I won't say teach them, but explain to them in a constructive way, try to explain to them what their attitude towards journalists should be. And I think they have to understand that journalists don't work for themselves. Journalists work for the good of the entire society. So if they interfere with the work of journalists, they're interfering with the fundamental rights that often are enshrined in the Constitution, in the constitutions of many countries, and that people are entitled to the enjoyment of those rights.
I think those are very pertinent comments, Fernando, and I'm thinking one of the things you've said, and maybe we need to do more of, is really to make a concerted effort to engage with our security forces, whether they be police or defense forces, and help them to understand about the human rights culture and why it is necessary not only to protect civilians, but more particularly journalists as well. And maybe with this combined effort, we can all take this fight against impunity to greater heights so we can finally conquer it. So, Fernando, I thank you so much for taking time. I know how busy you are in the newsroom. I remember those days well, and I really appreciate you giving your input in this vital discussion.
Thank you.